Chapter 1 is titled The Science of Psychology. There are three major sections to Chapter 1 that are titled Research Perspectives, Research Methods, and Research Results. The definition of psychology is the scientific study of observable behavior and mental processes. Observable behavior is anything that we can see people do. We can observe people engage in behavior in schools, offices, restaurants, bars, grocery stores, etc. Of course, these are all natural environments. We can also observe people in controlled environments. We can bring them into labs, sleep labs, or just waiting rooms where we can observe their behavior. Mental processes are the other major component of psychology. Mental processes are non-observable. They are abstract concepts such as memory, intelligence, and problem solving. We can study these concepts and we can attempt to measure them and create models to help explain them and better understand them, but ultimately mental processes are not things that can be simply observed. We cannot simply watch people's memory or watch people's intelligence or simply watch exactly what is going on in someone's mind when they problem solve. We can certainly time them to see how long it takes them to solve a problem, but we can't really understand what it is that they're thinking without asking them. Of course, there is a strong relationship between behavior and mental processes. How strong that relationship is also a major question in the field. We can all agree that there are many behaviors that occur without any sort of mental processes associated with them. And there's also the ability, of course, to have mental processes without any behavior associated with them. Psychology is very complex, considering that it covers all aspects of human behavior and mental processes, and therefore it's best understood using multiple perspectives. There are many different perspectives in the field of psychology. The four major perspectives are the biological perspective, cognitive perspective, behavioral perspective, and sociocultural perspective. We'll review each of these perspectives in the coming slides. So the biological perspective examines how biological concepts influence psychology. What are biological concepts? Those concepts include genetics, blood types, diets, metabolism, sleep, anatomy and physiology, concepts like neurotransmitters, hormones, and also drugs. So the biological perspective is interested in understanding how does our diet affect our behavior and our mental processes. When we drink coffee or drink alcohol, how does that affect our behavior and our mental processes? How does it affect our memory, our attention, our sleep, our speech, our mood? When we lack sleep, how does that affect our memory? How does it affect our decision making or our judgment? While we are sleeping, what kind of biological processes are in play? What parts of the brain are associated with sleep? What parts of the brain are associated with memory or intelligence or problem solving or balance and coordination? What factors do genes, what kind of influence do genes have on our psychology? Are there genes that are associated to sexuality, genes that are associated to music or mathematics or specific types of intelligence? How much of a role does genetics play in our intelligence and other types of psychological processes? These are areas of research that are concerned with the biological perspective of psychology. In Chapter 2, when we look at the chapter entitled Neuroscience, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the biological perspective, and we'll also be looking at studies that are focused on these areas of research. The cognitive perspective is a perspective of psychology that is focused solely on understanding mental processes like memory, attention, problem solving, and intelligence. It has little focus on observable behavior. It is interested in understanding the different stages of memory and how memories are formed. It is interested in understanding how we can best measure attention and how attention evolves over the lifespan, the different approaches that humans have towards solving problems, and the different types of intelligence that exist and how we can best measure intelligence. At this point, it's important to note that the cognitive perspective and the biological perspective, any other perspective of psychology, they complement each other. One is not better than the other. Psychology is so complicated that we need multiple perspectives to best explain it. And so we can also share areas of research within these different types of perspectives. So for example, we have a table here that demonstrates 4 different biological concepts and 4 different cognitive concepts. And so biological concepts like sleep, measuring sleep, understanding what parts of the brain are associated with sleep, that's a purely biological study. But when we start to investigate how does sleep influence our memory, or how does sleep influence our attention or our decision making, well, at that point the study becomes more balanced between the biological perspective and the cognitive perspective. When we look at how drugs influence the nervous system and different parts of our brain, that's a purely biological study. But when we look at how drugs like alcohol and marijuana affect our memory and our intelligence and other cognitive processes, well, then at that point it becomes a shared perspective. We're looking at we're looking at psychology from 2 different perspectives: the biological perspective as well as the cognitive perspective. And of course, we're interested in understanding what parts of the brain are associated with memory, intelligence, attention, and decision making. So all of these concepts, both biological and cognitive, they're both related to our psychology, but we can also study memory on its own without giving any thought into biological constructs like the areas of the brain. We can just solely look at the different types of memory that exist. We can look at at what age do we start forming memories. When it comes to intelligence, we can solely look at the different types of intelligence that exist, or the best way to formulate an intelligence test. And when we talk about when we present these questions or these research topics, there's very little emphasis on biology, and therefore it's more of a purely cognitive psychology research study. The behavioral perspective is more focused on understanding of observable behavior and trying to understand how our past experiences and consequences in the physical environment shape our behavior. So when we say consequences in the physical environment, we're talking about reinforcement and punishment. We're talking about the presence of models that we imitate. So when we consider classical conditioning and operant conditioning, these are some of the 2 major principles of the behavioral perspective. We're talking about learning by association, reward, punishment, and then with regard to social learning, that has to do with observation. So when we get to chapter 4 and we look at the behavioral perspective, we'll be looking at classical conditioning, which is learning by association. We'll be looking at operant conditioning, which is learning by reward and punishment. And then also social learning is how we learn by observation. And again, when we say learning, we're talking about learned behaviors. So when we see an individual engage in a behavior for the very first time, the idea is that this is a new behavior that they have learned. At least the behavioral perspective views the existence of that new behavior as something learned. Furthermore, when a behavior increases or decreases as a result of experiences such as reward and punishment, we also believe that there is learning that is taken place and shaped the behavior. The behavioral perspective can also be tied to the biological perspective and the cognitive perspectives. We look at Albert Bandura's theory, his social cognitive theory on the right. The social cognitive theory is basically a theory that shows that our behavior influences our decision making, our biology, and also shapes our environment as well. And it works in all different ways. So our environment also has a major influence on our behavior, and our environment also has an influence on our biology as well. For example, if we are in a crowded theater or a crowded room, the environment might have an influence on our blood pressure. It might have an influence on our heart rate, and therefore we might become a little bit more anxious, and we might become fearful. And so when we talk about moods like fear, emotions like fear, and we talk about how they're learned like phobias, those concepts are highly tied towards behaviorism. On the left, we have a more basic model of classical conditioning, operant conditioning. We have a cue or a stimulus in the environment which leads to a behavior, and then if there is a reward that's presented after that behavior or that routine, it can ultimately become a habit, and therefore the reward ends up becoming associated with the cue or the stimulus. So this model is used in training humans as well as training animals, and so we'll take a closer look at that in chapter 4. The sociocultural perspective, also known as social psychology, examines how other people as well as cultural factors influence our psychology. The 3 major topics of research include group conformity, also known as peer pressure, persuasion, also known as compliance techniques, and then obedience to authority as well. So I mentioned that group conformity has to do with peer pressure. That's essentially behaving like the rest of the group. There's other types of conformity as well besides peer pressure. Sometimes we are in a situation where we don't know exactly how we're supposed to behave, and so we look around to other people to see how they are behaving, and we may imitate their behavior, and that would be an example of conformity as well. Anytime we are acting like the rest of the group, that is an example of conformity. We also have persuasion. I referred to them as compliance techniques earlier. In the field of business, in the field of social relationships, there's a lot of persuasion in getting people to comply with our request, whether it be to give us a job or to give us a loan or to buy a car from us, or even to marry us. These are all questions or requests that we ask other people to say yes to, and there are many patterns and studies that have been shown that demonstrate some of the different influences or techniques that can be effective in getting people to comply with our requests. And obedience to authority looks closer at how we have a tendency to obey authority figures in our culture. Now, authority figures vary greatly. Police officers can be considered authority figures. Politicians, teachers, parents, doctors, lawyers, supervisors, bosses. It all has to do with context, really. As an instructor myself, if I'm teaching in a classroom, I'm the authority figure in the classroom, and so I have control and command, and typically I have a strong social influence on the behavior of my students. Typically, if they want to speak, they must raise their hand, and so as you can see, my presence there has a strong influence on their behavior because of the fact that I'm an authority figure. However, if I run into a student, at a restaurant and they're waiting tables or they're managing the restaurant, in that situation, they have more authority than I do. They have the authority to tell me to leave the premises, or they have the authority to maybe give me a discount on the bill, those kinds of things, because it all has to do with context of the situation. So that has to do with social psychology, and that will be the emphasis of Chapter 9. So here we have 4 different questions, and the first, actually we have 5 questions technically. The title asks which perspective is most relevant. So we have 4 different questions, and each one of these questions has some sort of indication that it is tied more closely to 1 or 2 different research perspectives of psychology than the others. So the first question says, should I be concerned that my child has trouble reading? Well, what is reading? People can read out loud, but people can also read silently. They can process information without speaking out loud. Ultimately, we have to be able to process the information in our mind. So reading at its basis, if it's something that we're unable to do or struggle with doing, ultimately we're saying that there is a mental process that is not effective. And so therefore, this would be an example of the cognitive perspective. The next question asks, why does alcohol make people act differently? And so we're basically asking, why does a drug or a substance have an influence on the behavior of other people? And so because the emphasis is on how does a drug influence behavior, that's going to be a biological question, because we're focused on the drug itself, and we're asking people, why does it make people change their psychology? Why are some people uncomfortable working in groups? Anytime the question has to do with groups and how groups influence an individual, that is going to be a question from the socio-cultural perspective. How can I teach my child to make their bed every morning? Well, we're talking about getting someone to engage in a behavior on a consistent basis, so therefore that has to do with the behavioral perspective. And notice, we didn't really answer the question. The first question, should I be concerned that my child has trouble reading? Well, it depends, how old they are and whether or not they've been tested and whether or not they're falling behind in their class. Why does alcohol make people act differently? Well, the answer would probably involve neurotransmitters and brain regions that are associated with our behavior. Why are some people uncomfortable working in groups? The answer to this question would probably involve some theoretical concepts such as conformity. or peer pressure, or we might even also make some references to some biological factors as well. But typically this is going to be answered having to do with social psychology concepts. How can I teach my child to make their bed every morning? Well, maybe the answer to this would be giving them a reward every time they make their bed. And so when we talk about a reward, like, that's basically a personal experience or environmental consequence, that would be most in line with the behavioral perspective. So this is the same concept. It says which perspective is most relevant. Here we have 4 different statements that have been proven to be true through psychological research. And so the first statement says depression is more common in Western societies that encourage individuality. And this has been proven to be true. So for example, the United States has a relatively high rate of depression compared to many other underdeveloped countries because in the United States it is thought that we encourage a lot more individuality. And so we believe that these differences in societies and culture, well, this is tied to sociocultural psychology. The next statement is depression can be attributed to a chemical imbalance in the nervous system. This has also been proven to be true through research. Research shows that certain neurotransmitters are associated with mood such as depression. And so many of you are probably already understanding that this has to do with the biological perspective. The next statement says that depression is associated with negative, irrational, and pessimistic thoughts and beliefs. Of course, that's true. Any of us who have ever experienced any type of depression understand that there's a lot of pessimistic thoughts and irrational beliefs and negative thoughts and emotions that are associated with depression. And so when we're talking about abstract concepts like irrational and pessimistic thoughts and beliefs, and these are essentially mental constructs, this has to do with the cognitive perspective. And then the last statement says depression can be attributed to negative personal experiences such as failure or rejection. When we talk about personal experiences or consequences to our behavior, what we're talking about is the behavioral perspective. And so hopefully this gives you an understanding that a concept like depression is very complex and requires multiple perspectives to truly and best understand it. When people try to explain depression, sometimes they might make a statement like it's all in your head. And so what these people are saying are essentially that depression is completely based from the cognitive perspective. They are saying that as long as all you have to do is change the way that you think, and you won't be depressed. And that's kind of a black and white style of thinking, because the truth is, or the research shows, that depression is not just in your head, it's also in your genes, it's also in your blood, it's also in your culture, it's also influenced by the behaviors that you engage in and your past experiences. And so a statement like it's all in your head is basically saying it only has to do with the cognitive perspective, and that kind of thinking is not conducive to best understanding how psychology works. So hopefully after taking this class, you'll have a more open-minded approach and the ability to understand psychology from multiple perspectives. What all of these different perspectives have in common is that they all conduct research, and they all share specific research methods. So the second section of the textbook, the second section of Chapter 1 is titled Research Methods. So research methodology in psychology involves different categories of research. We have descriptive methods of research, correlational studies, and experimental research. The idea is that we want to obtain data through these research methods, and we want to be able to organize the data and display them like we do here on the bottom left on the data table. And of course, we can use data tables in education, in healthcare, all sorts of different fields, criminal justice. So hopefully you're also starting to see that psychology is tied to a lot of different areas of study and a lot of different fields, not just in its own field, psychology. So we'll begin with descriptive methods, which are the most common types of research methods, and it's also the most basic category of research. It's important to keep in mind that descriptive research is focused on trying to describe what is happening, not why it is happening. When people start making statements like this is happening because of this, or people act this way because of this, that is a very, very dangerous and short-sighted way of thinking, because truthfully it's very difficult to state with causal certainty that one thing is having an absolute effect on someone's behavior. Now, there's lots of evidence to support that certain events and experiences and substances cause a change in people's behavior. But without knowing the research, it's very difficult to, and knowing how those answers, that information or those answers came to be, it's very difficult to make those statements. So we'll begin with the three different types of descriptive research methods, which are observational techniques, case studies, and surveys, and we'll talk about what each of these different techniques or methods look like. So observational techniques are very common and they're very basic. The primary objective is simply to describe observable behavior. And so it's important to note here that observational studies are very, they have very little effectiveness when it comes to cognitive psychology, because it has more to do with understanding how people behave in certain situations and being able to observe and document their behavior. And so therefore it's typically used for behavioral and sociocultural research. It's also important to understand that observations are very commonly used by supervisors, police officers, doctors, and so observations are very, very common. We use them all the time. We can make observations in laboratory settings or also natural environments like school, a workplace, or a bar. Anytime someone is coming in to supervise someone or observe how they're doing in terms of job performance, they are essentially engaging in psychological research. At the most basic level, they are essentially conducting observational research. On the bottom left, we have a classroom and we have a person in the back with a clipboard, and they are documenting what they observe. It's likely that this individual is observing either the teacher in the classroom and is likely a principal, and so they are observing how the teacher behaves and whether or not the teacher is engaging in appropriate teaching methods and styles, whether or not the teacher is keeping the students engaged, or they may be focused on just one student. There might be a student in the classroom that's having trouble behaviorally speaking, and so the person who's collecting the data, the researcher, might be a counselor or a social worker, and they are documenting their observations as to whether or not the student is participating in the class, whether or not they are being attentive in class, whether or not they are staying in their seat, whether or not they're asking for permission to engage in other behaviors like go to the bathroom. So it's really hard to say exactly what it is they're observing because it's just a picture. On the right, we have another type of observation occurring. It seems here that we've kind of recreated a natural environment in a laboratory setting. It looks kind of like a play area. We have a woman who is documenting behaviors that she observes. She's looking at a middle-aged man and an infant in a room with some toys. She might be observing the interaction between the adult and the child, and if that was the case, it might have to do with like an adoption agency or a social work situation, but that would be a type of sociocultural research because we're looking at the relationship between two people. Conversely, she might be interested more so on how the child interacts with the toys. She might be interested to see whether or not the child has any sort of neurodevelopmental disorder like autism. She might just simply be trying to see which one of the toys the child prefers. This very well might be a toy company, and they are trying to see whether or not babies spend more time with a green toy versus a blue toy, or a toy that lights up versus a toy that doesn't. All of these types of research hypotheses, none of them are incorrect, they're all plausible. So furthermore, again, it just goes to show you that psychology can be very complicated. However, we can collect a lot of data simply just by observing. A specific type of observational technique is known as participant observation. This involves the researcher becoming part of the group being observed. So the thing about being observed is that when people know that they're being observed, they have a tendency to change their behavior, especially if they understand that the observation can have an influence or an effect, or can have consequences. So for example, if you are an employee and you are being supervised or observed by your boss, you are likely to be on your best behavior. You may not be on your phone as much as you normally would be. And so therefore the observation that is taking place and the data that is being collected may not be as truthful or as authentic as ideally it would be if the person was not aware that they were being observed. And so a participant observation is about having the researcher becoming a member of the group that they're trying to observe. So it has a lot to do also with behavioral and sociocultural research. A very famous participant observation research study was conducted by David Rosenhan in 1973. And so Rosenhan was very interested in understanding how patients in psychiatric institutions were treated by psychiatrists and nurses with regard to how much social interaction they received from the doctors and the nurses. And so this data table that's displayed here, well, before I go any further, I should explain that what Rosenhan did was because he wanted to get a true look as to how they were being treated and how much interaction they received. Rosenhan and his colleagues got themselves admitted into a psychiatric institution, and they essentially feigned or faked symptoms so that way they can become patients in the institution, and they could get a more authentic, reliable observation of how the psychiatrists and the nurses behaved. Because if Rosenhan had called the hospital and made an appointment and explained to them what kind of research they were doing, and they were going to go and observe how the psychiatrists and nurses interacted with the patients, it's likely that the psychiatrists and the nurses would be behaving while they were being observed differently than how they normally would. And so this data here is basically just numbers that demonstrate, that most of the time the psychiatrists and nurses didn't really interact with the patients very much, and so that was concerning to him. And it was concerning when the results were published, because I think that most people would agree that patients in psychiatric institutions, social stimulation and social interaction is beneficial to their mental health. There's a question that's presented here. It says, how might police officers use this technique, being participant observation, for research purposes? And so I'll give you a minute to think about this. But when we talk about police officers becoming participants or members of the group they're trying to observe, what we're talking about is police officers going undercover. So the primary responsibility of police officers, not primary, but one of the major responsibilities, is for them to observe and document criminal behavior, whether it be something as simple as speeding or selling drugs. But of course, when we see a police officer, or when people, I should say, see a police officer, criminals, they're less likely to engage in criminal behavior. And so therefore, police officers sometimes have to become members of the group so that way they can get a better observation. Case studies are another very common type of descriptive research methods. It's a very common type of descriptive research method. Case studies are just detailed descriptions of an individual or group that summarize their development. It's very common in clinical settings. So what this means is that if you ever go to your healthcare provider, and you've been going to your healthcare provider for many years, it's likely that they have a case or a file on you that describes or summarizes your development, how much you've changed over the years with regard to your age and your weight and your blood pressure, your medications, so on and so forth. With regard to psychology, because we can make a case study out of pretty much anyone in every group, we typically only reserve, case studies or special case studies for people who are very unique. So this individual, Henry Malazan, HM, he was an individual who he had a very bad case of epilepsy. He was having recurrent seizures that were very debilitating, and we knew that, or I should say scientists knew, the doctors knew that they were able to determine where the seizures were starting, and they knew that if they removed that part of the brain, they would stop the seizures, but they didn't know what that part of the brain did. And so that part of the brain was known as the hippocampus, and so we'll be looking at that very closely in Chapter 2 and in Chapter 5, because what we learned from this case study was that that part of the brain was essentially responsible for memory formations. So after he got his hippocampus removed, he was essentially unable to form new long-term memories. He didn't lose any of his memories, he just was unable to form new memories. So after the surgery, if he met someone, he was able to engage in conversation with them, but after about 30 seconds, he wouldn't remember who they were because he was no longer able to form those new long-term memories. information from case studies, they can be useful to develop a hypothesis about general human development, but it's very difficult to prove, or very difficult to say with absolute certainty that this is exactly why it happened to them, or exactly that, or if we were to replicate that on an individual, that we would have the same results. And so you'll see on the bottom right, there's a picture of a book called Outliers. It's a very popular book, and it's a book having to do with psychology. And so what Outliers is basically a collection of case studies of people like Michael Jordan and Bill Gates. And what the author does is he summarizes their development, and he talks about where they came from and some of the unique experiences that they had that he believes contributed to their success. Obviously, being successful is something that many people are interested about and learning about. We all want to be successful. And so what he did was, he basically picked out who he believed to be some of the most successful people in history, including like a group like the Beatles. And he was just able to document what they experienced and what they went through. And ideally, after doing all this research, he's able to formulate a hypothesis. And actually, he was able to formulate a hypothesis after researching all of these people. He believed that the key to success, or the key to being an expert in a field, was essentially contributing about 10,000 hours to their respective field or their respective area of study, whether it be basketball or computers. But again, that's a very difficult thing to prove. If I invest 10,000 hours in playing a video game or playing a guitar, first of all, am I going to document those 10,000 hours? What do those hours look like? Am I fully engaged? And so it's very difficult to prove that that's necessarily true. It's just a hypothesis that he was able to develop out of that. So case studies can be very interesting. Anytime you see a documentary on an individual, that's likely just going to be a case study, and we can learn certainly a lot about that individual, and hopefully we can take a little bit from that and try to better understand how humans in general change and develop. But for the most part, it's very difficult to generalize the findings of a case study towards all humans. Surveys are another type of descriptive research method that are really good at getting information from mental processes of people, like their attitudes and their opinions and their beliefs, because we can ask them how they think and how they feel and what they believe in. We can also ask them about their behaviors. We can ask them how often they go to the bathroom in a day, or we can ask them how much they eat in a day, or we can ask them how many hours they sleep a night. And now the problem with surveys is, I should start off with the benefits of survey. The good thing about surveys is that we can collect a lot of information from a large group of people. But the problem is that sometimes people can answer the surveys incorrectly. They can lie, they can misunderstand the question, they can skip a question, and so that can create a lot of problems. And this goes to show you that research, psychological research, including surveys and questionnaires, they're not perfect by any means, but it's better than nothing, and it does give us a better insight as to what it is that people are thinking and how they're behaving as a group. I have an image here that basically says complete the shopping survey from Kroger. Any of you who are shopped at Kroger, you probably know that after you finish your shopping trip, they give you a receipt and they ask you to take a survey. If you've ever taken that survey, you know that some of the questions they ask you are your age, your income, but then they also, so that we consider those demographics like your gender, your age, your income, your race or ethnicity, but then we also begin to ask you questions about your psychology relative to Kroger. So for example, how often do you come to the store? How often do you pump gas at Kroger? Are you likely or not to recommend Kroger to a friend? When you were at Kroger, did you shop at the deli? What did you think of the deli? Did you perceive the store to be clean? Did you use the restroom? Did you perceive the restrooms to be clean? So as you can see with those questions, we're asking them not only about their behavior, but also about their thoughts. And so surveys are very effective in that sense. And the great thing about surveys is that we collect a lot of data from a bunch of different variables, and then from there we can determine whether or not there's any relationships between these variables, like how much income a person makes and whether or not they shop at the seafood department or the deli, or whether or not their gender or their age has an influence or is related to it all, how many times they pump gas at Kroger. And that information may not be interesting or important important to you, but I'm sure we can all agree that that information is interesting and certainly important and beneficial to Kroger, so that way they can better suit the needs of their clientele. At this point, it's important to consider the difference between a sample and a population. So we use these terms a lot in describing psychological research, especially with surveys. The population is the group of people that we want to learn about. And so, for example, Kroger is interested in learning about their customers. Kroger really isn't interested in learning about people who shop at H-E-B. They're interested in people who shop at Kroger. And if you shop at Kroger and H-E-B, that's fine. You still fall into the population of people who shop at Kroger. A lot of times people get the term population confused with the general population of the United States of America. And certainly there are some surveys who are interested in doing that, but that's a very difficult task considering there are 300 million people in the United States of America. And I mean, the idea that and the population is going to be all humans, the 8 billion people on the planet, not really sure there's any research studies where the goal is to essentially explain when we get into developmental psychology, you'll see that we do try to describe or summarize development of humans in general, but at least when it comes to surveys, typically the population of surveys is going to be targeted to a specific group of people, like college students or police officers or social workers. And so if we want to learn about police officers and we want to learn about on average how much sleep do police officers make, on average, how many times do police officers use their service weapon throughout their career? On average, how many times have police officers, gone beyond the call of duty to help someone or bought someone something out of pocket, or how much of their job has to do with drugs versus some other type of activity or behavior. One of the ways that we can do that is get a sample of police officers, and we can survey them and ask them questions. And if the sample is representative enough of the general population, when I say the general population, I do mean all police officers, then we can use the data that we get from that sample to describe all police officers. And so, if you're going to describe all police officers, which is a very difficult thing to do because you understand that we have police officers in rural areas, police officers in urban areas, police officers in New York City are going to have a very different type of experience than police officers in Lake Jackson, Texas, although they are going to share some commonalities. And of course, some police officers work in narcotics and some of them don't, so on and so forth. So it is not a perfect system by any means. But we can get 1,000 police officers from different parts of the country, and maybe we can get some police officers from Lake Jackson to be in the survey, and we can also get some people from New York, some police officers from New York to be in the survey, and we can ask them all sorts of questions. And then if we get 1,000 or 2,000 police officers, inexperienced ones, experienced ones, rookies and sergeants, and people in narcotics and people that are not in narcotics, black police officers, white police officers, male police officers, female police officers, and we have this really, really diverse sample that kind of looks like or is representative of the general population, then any of the findings that we get from the sample, it's pretty much fair game, or at least safe to be able to say, well, if 10% of the sample engaged in this type of behavior, or if the average sleep pattern of this sample is 6 hours a night, it's pretty safe to say that police officers in general sleep about 6 hours a night, if that's what the data shows. So again, the sample is the subset of the target population. And this is best achieved through random sampling. What this means is that ideally everyone who's a member of the population, all police officers in theory, have the ability to become part of the sample. And so again, that might make it really difficult to create a study that's meant to describe the psychology of all police officers. But I'm sure you could survey all the people who shop, or you can basically give a survey to all the people who pass through Kroger in Lake Jackson, and although they're not all going to take it, the ones that do, ideally they are going to look somewhat like the rest of the population. All right, variables and correlational studies. So a variable is anything that can be measured or take on more than one value, such as age, income, education, religiosity, political views, drug use, sexual behaviors, sleep patterns, eating patterns, intelligence levels, you name it. Any one of these things is a variable because the scores can vary from one person to another. What correlational studies do is they describe the strength of the relationship between these variables. So for example, income and education. I'm sure many of you have heard of or are comfortable with the idea that there is a relationship between income and education, and that is that as education increases, income increases or tends to increase. That's a very important modifier. It tends to is likely to increase because there, of course, there are people with very high levels of education that have low income, and we have some people with very low levels of education who have very high levels of income. And we call those individuals outliers because they are essentially not in the path of the pattern, which we're going to see in a little bit. But before we move any further, you look at drug use and education. Although there are people who have very high levels of education that do engage in high levels of drug use, for the most part what we see is that people with high levels of drug use tend to have low levels of education. And so as you can see there, it's kind of like an inverse relationship. And so what we have here is positive correlations and negative correlations. Now, positive does not mean good and negative does not mean bad. What these statements or these words mean is they indicate whether or not the relationship is a direct relationship or an inverse relationship. So with regards to positive correlations, also known as direct correlation or direct relationship, we have low scores that are paired with low scores and high scores that are paired with high scores, such as education and income. As education increases, income tends to increase. But as I said before, we have people who, dropped out of high school or dropped out of college and they became very successful and have a lot of income. And we have people who are very highly educated who maybe study in a field that isn't very doesn't have a great job market, like a field like philosophy or drama, and so maybe they're making very low wages doing something else. And so as you can see, education is not the sole causing factor of our income. The field of study, the era that we grow up in, also the region that we live in. There are some regions of our country or the world where the cost of living is so high that people with a bachelor's degree, or for example teachers with a bachelor's degree in an area that has a very high cost of living, they're likely to get paid more than teachers in another area where the cost of living is much lower. And so what this goes to show you is that there's lots of variables that influence something like our income. Income and life expectancy. These are two variables that have also been proven to be positively correlated. And what this states is if someone tells you, if you were to read a research study and the title of the research study shows income and life expectancy positively correlated, what that means is that as people's income increases, their life expectancy also tends to increase as well. What this means is that people with more money tend to live longer. They are likely to. All the time? No. Absolutely no. But this does allow us to make predictions. And so if someone gives us information like their education level, we can predict with some confidence of what their income is like. If someone, and furthermore, we can also predict with some confidence what their life expectancy is as well, because all of these variables are related to one another to some degree. Now we also have negative correlations that indicate an inverse relationship. Low scores on one variable tends to be paired with high scores on the other variable and vice versa. So for example, research has proven that as education increases, tobacco use tends to decrease. And so what this means is that people with high levels of education, they are less likely to use tobacco than people with low levels of education. Now I'm not saying that this is good or bad. I'm not saying that income or education makes a person better than another person. all we're doing is looking at two variables, education and tobacco usage. And so what this does, it also allows us to make predictions. If someone tells you, or if you have data about an individual, and the individual, you know the individual smokes 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and that's all you know about the individual, you can make a prediction about their education level. You can make a prediction about their life expectancy. You can make a prediction about their income based on the research, not based on your agenda or your opinions or your biases or what you want to believe is true. You make these predictions or these assumptions, if you will, based on the data or the research that has been presented to you. Are there people with high levels of education and high levels of income that smoke a lot of tobacco or use lots of? Yes, there are, but those are outliers. And there are also people who use high levels of tobacco and have a high life expectancy. And so it works both ways, in the sense that, you know, if we're going to essentially accept the research, or we're going to be comfortable with the data only when it suits our agenda, well, then that is not objective. And so the goal of psychology, or the goal of science, is to be an objective researcher, to be able to look at data and information and to make objective, non-biased predictions and assessments without any sort of agenda in mind. We also have age and physical activity that are negatively correlated. As people get older, their physical activity tends to decline. Yes, of course, we're going to have a few people who are very old or in their 60s and they're at the gym and they're, you know, very strong and engaging in lots of physical activity. But of course, if you go to the gym, what you're likely to see is you're going to see a lot of people in their 20s and their 30s, and less so much people in their 70s and their 80s. Now, of course, there's other patterns as well. You know, the time of day, you know, that also influences, you know, what time people are exercising, what kind of population is exercising. So all of these factors are you know, involved. But are we trying to predict their physical activity, or are we trying to predict what time of the day they engage in physical activity? Because those are two different variables. The time of day they exercise and how much they exercise, those are two different variables. So correlations, these relationships, they can produce, if we insert them into a software, they can produce something called a correlation coefficient. A correlation coefficient, this is a 2-digit decimal number. It's a statistic that basically describes the strength and the relationship of a correlation. And so they can range from -1 to +1, although we never have absolute correlations. It's always going to be a 2-digit decimal number like 0.95 or -0.95. Now, it's important to understand that 0.95 and -0.95, those two relationships have the same strength. They are both extremely strong relationships. It's just that they are going in different directions. So on the bottom, we have 3 different scatter plots that demonstrate 3 different correlations. On the left, we have a very strong positive correlation. And so this would basically be associated to a 2-digit decimal correlation coefficient that would be positive, and it would be very close to 1, such as 0.75 or 0.85 or 0.82. On the right, we have a very strong negative correlation, a very strong pattern there, and this would be associated with a 2-digit decimal correlation coefficient that was negative, like -0.75 or -0.82. And in the middle, we have a near zero correlation. We don't really see any pattern there. But if you look at if you look at the scatter plot on the left that shows the positive correlation, or the scatter plot on the right that shows the negative correlation, you can see that if I give you a score for one variable, if I give you the score for X, you can predict the score for Y based on the data that you have. And these variables can be education, income, tobacco usage, whatever. It all just varies on the study. So for example, if you look at, you know, the correlation on the left, the scatter plot on the left, if I give you the score of variable X of an individual, and I say this individual scored a 5 on variable X, you can use that score and you can use the data that's provided there to predict what their score on variable y is going to be, and it's probably not going to be a 15. It's probably not going to be a 12 or a 10 or an 8. It's more likely to be a 5 or a 6 or a 4, because as you can see there's a pattern there, and it shows that low scores tend to be paired with low scores and high scores tend to be paired with high scores. I've mentioned that there's a lot of variables that interact with one another, and this creates some issues known as the third variable problem. Because even though education and income are related to each other, there's other variables that we need to consider, like the region that the person works in or the field that the person is in. And that's why correlations allow us to make predictions, but correlations do not imply causation. And now, in some situations like income and education, making a prediction about someone's income based on their education, it's not so harmful. If you predict their income's wrong, then if you predict their income wrong, it's not the end of the world. No one's going to die. But if you look at this data table here, this gives you an example of a time in which we saw a very strong positive correlation, or I'll just say a very strong correlation between two variables, that being the month of the year or the temperature of the year, as well as the amount of ice cream being sold. And we see that that polio cases were very similarly displayed along the same lines as ice cream sales. So what we see is that there's very high cases of polio and very high cases of ice cream sales in the summer months like July, August, and September and June. And in the winter months like January, February, and December, there's very low cases of polio and very low ice cream sales. And so what this shows is that, well, as ice cream sales increase, so does polio cases. And as ice cream sales decrease, so do polio cases. And so this data actually existed, and this actually led to scientists and researchers and healthcare providers in 1949 being concerned that polio was tied to ice cream sales and other dairy products. And so there was actually kind of a scare on ice cream. But what it was showing actually is that, what ends up happening is that it's during the summer months that people go out and they interact with each other more, and they go to concerts and they're out in public more, and school's out and that kind of stuff. And so they're interacting with each other more. And so they're also buying more ice cream because it's warm, but they're also spending more time at the beach, so on and so forth. And so therefore they're coming in more contact with each other, and they're more likely to transmit an infectious disease like polio. So yes, we can predict, if using this graph, if you were to, ask me, in the following, summer, what do you think ice cream, and they were telling me in the following summer, we're going to have record sales of ice cream. I could probably predict that you're also going to have record cases of polio as well. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm making that prediction based on the data that's being given to me. But by no means am I ever saying that ice cream causes polio. Like, you have to just reserve those kinds of statements and reserve that kind of thinking for when we conduct experiments. So experiments are the only type of research methods that can demonstrate cause and effect relationships. Experiments can be very simple, and they can be very complicated as well. In theory, a simple experiment is as follows. We have two groups. We have an experimental group and a control group. Participants are randomly assigned to both of these groups, to either one of these groups, I should say. And the experimental group is exposed to an independent variable, such as a drug or a treatment or or some sort of modification. Something is done to the experimental group that the control group is not done, that is not done to the control group, and then we measure something in both groups to see whether or not there was an effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So here we have the independent variable being sleep, and so we have two groups. Group 1 receives 2 hours of sleep, and group 2 receives 10 hours of sleep. And so I think here it's obvious that what we're manipulating is the independent variable. And so I think the experimental group is probably going to be the 2 hours of sleep group, because I think that the 10 hours is more normal than 2 hours. And so as you can see, we have two groups, and each group has 10 students each. And then and they're paired or matched for age and gender and normal sleeping length. And what this means is that, the group 2 has the same amount of males or females as group A, and has this, and there's no major differences in age. They look very similar to one another, and we also don't ask them which group they want to be. And you can't just go with your friends. Like, we want to make the groups look as similar to each other as possible, and we usually achieve this actually just through random assignment. Right? Basically saying, all right, you go here, you go there, you go left, you go right, you go to group A, you go to group B, just back and forth. And that usually does basically give us two groups that are pretty similar to one another. And then we have reaction time, which is what we measure. And so maybe we can give them some sort of reaction time test, whether it be playing video games or driving a golf cart or something, and we ask them, have them go through an obstacle course. And what ends up happening is we measure the reaction time in both groups. And if there is a significant difference between the two groups, well, we can say with confidence that it has to do with the amount of sleep that the group got, because everything else was kind of balanced, if you will, or accounted for through random assignment. And so it's not like we had some sort of information that led us to believe that one group already, a certain group of people already had slow reaction, and so we kind of put them into group A and the other people in group B. No, they were just randomly assigned, and then the only thing that we manipulated was the 2 hours of sleep as opposed to the 10 hours. We could have a third group of people that got 5 hours of sleep. Instead of sleep, we could do caffeine. We could, rather than sleep, we don't even ask them how much they slept the night before. We just randomly assign them to different groups, and then group 1, we give them caffeine, and group 2, we don't give them caffeine. Or group 1, we give them alcohol. Group 2, we don't give them alcohol. Group 1 gets to use the notes while they take the test. Group 2 does not get to use the notes while they take the test. And so what we're doing is we're manipulating one thing between the two groups, and that one thing is known as the independent variable. What we measure afterwards, like their reaction time or the amount of mistakes that they made or their test score, that's the dependent variable. Because in theory, the dependent variable, their score should depend on whether or not they were exposed to the independent variable and to what degree. Sometimes when we do healthcare studies or studies that involve drugs, when people know that they're getting a drug, when people know that they're getting a treatment, that can sometimes have an influence on the way that they think or they behave. So much so that research has shown is that we can give people an inactive treatment. We can give people a pill that essentially does nothing, and we can see observed changes. So for example, research has shown that we can bring people in for antidepressant medication clinical trials, and we can give one group of people a placebo treatment, basically an ineffective pill, and we can lie to them and tell them that they are being we can tell them they're getting an active treatment. And what ends up happening is many of these people report changes in their psychology because they believe that they received a treatment. This is known as a placebo effect. I was talking about how humans tend to change their behavior when they're being observed. Humans are very interesting in that when we have our own agenda, or when we are biased in any way, shape, or form, that might also influence the way that we perceive people or the way that we observe them. And so if we have a bias towards a particular group of people, or we believe that a group of people should be acting a certain way because they received a treatment, well, then we might basically be more inclined to call things in our favor, or if it's on the fence. If something's not really clear but we're looking for something to be true, if we're looking hard enough, we're typically going to see it. And so we might be paying closer attention to a particular group of people because they're the group of people that receive treatment. And so as you can see, we're treating that group differently because we know something about them. And so one of the ways that we can account for that is something called a double-blind procedure. Essentially, the people who are doing the observations or who are collecting the data from the two different groups, they themselves do not know who received the placebo treatment and who received the effective treatment. The last section of the textbook is understanding research results. So once we get all of this data that's been collected from research methods, we're able to organize it. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to talk about the different types of descriptive statistics that exist, and then we'll talk about how we display descriptive statistics using frequency distributions. So there's lots of different types of descriptive statistics out there. We have a category of descriptive statistics called measures of central tendency. The reason they're called measures of central tendency is because, well, they are basically a description of how average or typical these scores are. And typically these measures or these statistics, they are usually towards the middle of the score set. And so the mean typically falls somewhere in the middle of all the scores. The median is, by definition, the middle score. And the mode is the most common score, which is also typically going to be somewhere in the middle as well. If you give an exam to a bunch of students, typically the mean, the median, and the mode is going to be somewhere in around the 80 to 85 range. Very rarely are you going to have your average, your mean, median, and mode be like in the low 20s, and we're talking about in a range from 0 to 100. So these are your typical scores, the mean, the median, and the mode. But there are some issues with these, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Before we go any further, I also want to address measures of variability. And so measures of variability is a description of how much the scores vary from one another. And there's two different types. We have the range, which is the difference between the highest score and the lowest score. And we also have the standard deviation, which is the distance from the mean. You probably heard of the range before, and that's a very easy concept. You know, if someone gets at the highest score in a class is a 95 and the lowest score is a 60, well then the range is 35. Standard deviation, it's a little bit more difficult to understand. Before we get there, we'll talk about frequency distributions. Frequency distributions are essentially bar graphs that demonstrate how often a score occurs in a data set. So normal distributions, they look like the picture presented below, also known as a bell curve. They are symmetrical, as you can see. And in these situations, the mean, the median, and the mode are all equal. They typically fall right in the middle. It's the middle score is the most common score, and because it's symmetrical, the low score, the very extreme low scores cancel out the very extreme high scores, and therefore the average is also in the middle as well. But this is a very rare occurrence. Actually, it pretty much never happens to have a perfectly normal, absolute symmetrical distribution. Pretty much never happens. So, but what it does is it serves as a basis for comparison. So that way when we see other distributions that are basically leaning to the left or leaning towards the right, we can describe them based in comparison to this this symmetrical bell curve. And as this shows here, most real life distributions are skewed. So I was talking about standard deviations earlier. So in a normal distribution, basically about 2/3 of the scores are going to fall within one standard deviation of the mean. And as you can see here, we have that little fancy Greek M symbol in the middle, which stands for mean. And so if someone scores within, basically the vast majority of people are going to fall within one standard deviation of the mean. If I were to give an exam, like I said, and the average score was an 85, typically the vast majority of scores, probably about 2/3 of the scores, are going to fall somewhere between 70 and 95. And we're going to have just a few scores that fall below 70 and a few scores that fall above 95. Standard deviations are helpful and also basically describing our percentile ranks. And so if a person scores 2 standard deviations above the mean, then they are likely in the 98th percentile. And so if someone does receive the highest score in the class, they are likely going to also be able to be described not only as in the 99th percentile, but we can also describe them as being 3 standard deviations above the mean. The person who receives the lowest score on the exam will be able to describe them as also being 3 standard deviations below the mean. But the vast majority of people are going to fall within 1 standard deviation. So the standard deviation is just like basically a unit of measurement that describes how far away from the average you are. So here we have examples of right skewed and left skewed distributions. So on the left we have a right skewed distribution, and this is not a normal or symmetrical bell curve. This is actually more truthful. This is more what you're likely to come across when you look at data sets, the right skewed and the left skewed, not necessarily right or left, but one of these two. So it includes scores that are much higher than the mode and increases the average. So as you can see here, we have the mode is actually pretty low compared to all the other scores. It's pretty far to the left, and so we have a lot of low scores and very little high scores. And so but the high scores are going to essentially pull the mean above the mode. Okay, on the right side, what you see is that we have a lot of high scores, but we also have some really low scores as well too. And so these really low scores are going to pull the mean below the mode. And so what this really shows you is that the mean is not always a perfect descriptor. The mode is actually probably a more common or more, I guess, effective statistic to describe a data set. And so oftentimes students ask me for a class average on an exam. And although a class average can give you some insight as to how the class does as a whole, it doesn't, it's probably not going to be more representative of you as an individual. The mode is more likely to describe you as an individual because the mode is the most common score. And if I get some people who get like zeros on the exam, and that's going to obviously bring down the mean drastically, and that would be an example of a left skewed distribution. All right. And so if you were to, I guess, compare the analogy of like grades, on the right skewed, we would have basically the most common scores are C's, but we have some extreme scores that are A's, and what that does is that's going to increase the average to be like more like a B. And then on the right side, the most common scores are A's, but then we have some really low scores like some D's also, and that's going to basically bring down the class average to more like a B or a C. This data table, or this frequency distribution, is a little bit easier to understand because it has numbers attached to it. And so what this shows is basically the relative frequency of yearly income. So how often does this happen, these annual incomes? So how often does it happen that someone makes $210,000 a year? Not all that often. At least not when compared to people who make $20,000 or $25,000 or $30,000 a year. So as you can see, this is a right skewed distribution. And what's going to end up happening is, although the most common scores are going to be $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, and $30,000 a year, we're going to have quite a few extreme scores that are 180, 190, 200, 210. And so what these scores are going to do is they're going to essentially pull the mean closer towards the center. And so therefore the average income is not going to be 20 or 25 or 30. Due to those extreme scores, the average income is actually going to be more like 40 or 45. And so when we say that the average income is $45,000 or $50,000, I mean, how well does that describe all of the people in this data set? And so therefore, it's important to have as many descriptive statistics as possible. Well, that concludes the Chapter 1 lecture. We've talked about the 4 major perspectives of psychology. We talked about research methods, and we also talked about research results.